So the first question, oh, and here's another link 5G from New York City that people ask me is, well, what are the government standards for cell towers and cell phones? And, help me understand all of this. And I'm actually writing a chapter on that right now. I stay up to date with EHT, and we'll be able to read a more in-depth look at our regulations. But the regulations that we have limits for human exposure in the US for what's allowed to be in the air from cell towers or wireless networks. We also have limits on the cell phone emissions, and they have been unchanged since 1996 when they were set. Unreviewed in terms of looking at all of the science, but they were set in 1996. Now they're based on studies that are from the 80s. And actually also the 70s. And they are not designed to address biological impacts like cancer, impacts to the brain, memory, impacts to thyroid or hormones. They are not designed to address modern technology and the real world exposure of numerous devices at once. You might have a cell tower outside your window, and you're using a phone, and you're looking at a wireless laptop, and you're wearing a smartwatch. Yet the way, the structure that we have for limits does not consider all of that at once. It just considers one thing at a time, one phone at a time, one smartwatch at a time. It doesn't combine those near and far field exposures. It also doesn't address children's vulnerability. A lot of the science on impacts to children and pregnancy, that has been more recently published post 1996. But the FCC limits have not shown that they never even had that data at the time. And they certainly didn't have the data on long-term exposures. They just didn't have the amount of science that we have now. And they also didn't have studies or even a consideration for environmental impacts, impacts to birds, to bees, to trees, not a part of the limits. These limits are human exposure limits. I'll circle back to that. But in 2019, the FCC decided that its RF limits did not need to be updated. It made a decision after many years of asking the question and accepting submissions about, should our limits be updated? Do the limits adequately protect children? Should we have a precautionary approach? These were questions that the FCC posed to the public, and people submitted saying, yes, we need more protections. Yes, we need to update. Yes, we need a full scientific review, and children need protections, and wildlife needs protection. But the FCC decided in 2019 that actually it didn't, that we could just keep our limits. There didn't need to be a full update that happened. Now, this was not an update in 2019. This was a determination by the FCC that the limits did not need to be go through the process of being updated. And taking a hop back, I want to talk a little bit more about the limits. They were based on studies on a threshold of heating, a level of heating that they identified from studies from the 70s and 80s with just a few rodents and a few small monkeys, where they put microwave frequencies that elevated the heat for under 60 minutes. Under 60 minutes of exposure, high microwave exposure, and these little animals had been trained to press a lever for food. And when they were microwaved, and they were starved before the exposures to make sure that they were hungry, when the animals stopped pressing the lever for food, the mostly engineers said, well, okay, we've reached the heating level. These animals are overheated, their whole body's overheated, and this is bad. And they decided that that was the level of adverse effect, this overheating under 60 minutes of exposure. And that is how those limits were set so far, decades ago. That is how the first idea that The limits need to be based on heating, like a microwave, not on biological effects, cancer, neurological effects, hormones, thyroid, so forth. So when the FCC made that decision in 2019, Environmental Health Trust sued the FCC, saying, you have not looked at all the science. You haven't looked at the up-to-date science. And by the way that you test phones and you test cell towers, it's not relevant to the exposures we actually have. Other groups also did the same. Children's Health Defense, many individuals, many scientists. I personally sued myself. My name is on this case. There are over a dozen petitioners. And the case, Environmental Health Trust et al. Versus the FCC, there was a decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, that's just under the Supreme Court, the circuit courts. They ruled that the FCC's decision not to update its 1996 limits was arbitrary and capricious. The court found that the FCC had not provided evidence of properly examining long-term exposure, children's vulnerability, the RF radiation compliance test procedures that use that distance or that don't look at cumulative sources, the testimony of people who are injured. There were hundreds of testimonies by people who had various injuries, who talked about getting a brain tumor after long-term cell phone use, getting headaches, being debilitated by high levels of RF radiation from towers, perhaps that went up near their home, or smart meters that went on their home and then they became ill. Just hundreds of testimonies, and yet the FCC ignored that when it made its decision in 2019. The FCC also was found to ignore the studies on impacts to the reproductive system and to the brain. And the court said that the FCC had completely failed. It had a complete failure to address environmental effects, impacts to birds, bees, and trees, all of which were on the official record. There were over 10,000 pages of studies and scientific papers that had been submitted, most of which were completely ignored by the FCC, and the court saw that. The court then had an official mandate, an order to the US government and the FCC to explain how its limits were protective of the issues it had ignored. And it had a mandate that went out saying, you need to show and explain how the 1996 limits address the impacts of long-term exposure, of the test distance, of impacts, non-cancer impacts like impacts to the brain and reproduction, and impacts to the environment. And also, the court said, you need to explain how your 1996 limits even protect with modern technology, and the way we have technology today is totally different, of course, than from 1996. So explain how those limits really apply. Now, in talking about these, I forgot probably the most important thing, which is that the FCC has not responded. There's been no response. That was in 2021. We're now, years later, and still no response from the FCC, not a peep. Now, in the meantime, I have been submitting all of the latest science to the FCC, because the FCC is even making new rules and talking about new frequencies that it wants to have human exposure limits on, yet they do not have safety data on that. So I have continued to submit science to the FCC so that they will have it on their official record. And frankly, so that as there will be future lawsuits, that will be documented that they knew. They have not responded to this court ruling. The other thing I need to add is that they didn't go to the Supreme Court to challenge this ruling. This ruling stands, and yet the FCC has not responded. Therefore, the FCC cannot say that, or any entity, companies cannot say that the limits of the US government, the FCC human exposure limits, that they rest on a full research review of all of the up-to-date science. Now, let's look at our limits for cell towers and wireless radiation in the air as applied to homes and schools. This shows a country comparison of just a few select countries. Now, I have put, for example, Switzerland and Italy, they have limits that are applicable. They have limits, and then they have limits that apply for homes and schools where you live for some countries say, you know, where you reside, where you are for over 4 hours a day. They have all different rules, but nonetheless, these are sort of what the effective limits are for inside your home, and you're right outside of your home, and where young children. Some even apply to where hospitals are. The way our limits are, it depends on the frequency, but just as an example, for the 1,800 megahertz frequency, the US government and Japan have among the highest, the least restrictive, the most lenient limits for what cell towers are allowed to emit, compared to many countries in the world. We have just given it all to the cell tower companies, okay? It's a gift that we have given. The Australia and actually many other countries have limits that use ICNIRP limits, and those are slightly lower, still heat-based, very lenient compared to other countries such as Switzerland, Italy, Russia, China, India, and actually many Eastern European countries that allow that have more restrictive, more stringent limits for cell towers. The international, just to give you some perspective on the opposition or the awareness in some groups and some entities over time, the International Association of Firefighters is one of many organizations officially opposed to cell towers, on their stations, if you look internationally. Now, the International Association of Firefighters came out with a resolution on cell towers on their stations because there had been some early studies that found neurological impacts when cell antennas were mounted on their stations. And they have a resolution which states that until a study with the highest scientific merit and integrity on the health effects of exposure to low intensity radio frequency microwave radiation is conducted, and it is proven that such sightings are not hazardous to the health of our members, they don't want cell towers on their stations. And in fact, when in LA, actually in California too, but what I'm about to show you is from LA. It's a little ad, 30-second ad that the firefighter unions put out related to installations that were going up on LA stations. And here is the ad that they put out to galvanize the community against putting cell towers on their stations. Oops. Sorry.
Firefighters living and working beneath cell towers like this one have gotten sick. Headaches, extreme fatigue, memory loss, and brain scans show that firefighters exposed to toxic RF radiation experience cell death, ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. Now, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors has approved cell tower installations on fire stations in neighborhoods like yours. Call the Board of Supervisors and tell them to stop the cell towers now.
And there are many such efforts by firefighter unions in California. In fact, when there was a 5G fast track streamlining law, actually several of them that have been either proposed or ultimately passed, the firefighter unions were able to carve their stations out of the legislation because they lobbied hard, saying that they didn't want their stations to be cell tower sites. Yet, across the nation, we are seeing many fire stations of cell towers on them. That's because the firefighters are not fully aware of all of the science and all of the research. And we have a webpage on ehtrust.org that talks about firefighters. You can just search firefighters And you'll get to that page where we have everything about the firefighter unions, the California firefighters, the International Association of Firefighters, and what's going on. And here's another example, right? We've got these rooftop antennas. I mean, they're ugly, but they also emit invisible radiation that's going out all over cities across the United States. Rooftop antennas on near where homes are that are emanating out. I mean, we are contacted by people all the time that are finding they developed headaches or other physical health effects, and they realize that there's a cell antenna right outside because you've got this building, then you've got a building right next to it, right? So the building next to it they're in line of sight of these antennas where the main beam is. And people have reported getting sick. They are going to their senators, their elected officials, and being told that, well, the federal government, FCC limits, they're compliant with that, and there's nothing we can do. This is unacceptable, and we are working to change that. So here's another example of the Link 5G antennas. We are told, here's a clip from an ad, that this is 5G built right. We're building the most powerful 5G experience in more places around the country now so more people can experience it. This is what we are told by the companies. That's an advertisement. What we're not told is that 5G is being built right in front of our homes. And that is what it means. And allowing, there are 50 states, actually, over 50 states that have laws, state laws that make it so local communities can't have all the restrictions that they may want regarding these kinds of installations in the rights of way. And at the state level, wireless companies are lobbying hard and have lobbied hard to get those state streamlining laws so that they can do this, and so the local city council of the local town can't stop it. Please, again, ehtrust.org to learn more. Here are some pictures. This picture was sent to me by a professor in Pennsylvania, and here's this, looks small, right? It's like this little, and this is a picture from a separate facility in New Orleans, but this looks pretty small, right? Well, it's actually the radiation that is coming off of that. This professor shared with me the RF reports. It was so high. I have never seen such high levels in a house as I have from this facility right outside her third floor bedroom window. She can't use the third floor of her house now. Can't use it. The levels are just excessive inside that window. It's coming through the window, and so she doesn't use the third floor at all. Because of that, it's right in line of sight of the window. And here's another example in New Orleans. They're going up everywhere. I mean, this is just so close to the home there. And there are many, many studies, as I talked about. Again, you can learn more at ehtrust.org. But one I'll point out is a Europarlament Study Service research report from 2021 called The Health Impact of 5G that concluded for the wireless frequencies that are in use now, that 5G is using, those low band frequencies, that it is probably carcinogenic in humans, in particular related to glioma, a kind of brain tumor, and acoustic neuroma. And they also talked about reproductive and developmental effects, stating that these frequencies clearly affect male fertility and possibly female fertility too. They may have possible adverse effects on the development of embryos, fetuses, and newborns. So if you're grappling with this issue in your community, take a look at that study. It's a useful one to share with your elected officials on this issue.